Well, good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for being here on such a busy week. We're really grateful. I'm Mark Russo, Dean of Libraries, and it's my pleasure on behalf of the university and on the libraries to welcome you to today's presentation by Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson. Dr. Hooten Wilson serves as the newly appointed Fletcher Jones Endowed Chair of Great Books at Pepperdine University, where in 2004 she received her BA in Creative Writing from Seaver College. We're delighted to welcome you back and welcome you to today's event. We're so grateful you're here. So prior to or following her graduation from Pepperdine, she pursued studies at the University of Dallas and at Baylor University, where in 2009 she received her PhD. An avid lifelong lover of books and reading, Dr. Hooten Wilson remains busy writing, reading, and in recent months, leading and teaching in the university's Great Books program. In between these activities, she hosts a podcast entitled The Scandal of Reading, Pursuing Holy Wisdom with Christ and Pop Culture, where she engages in lively discussions with leading authors, professors, and theologians. Her most recent project, and the topic of today's lecture, and the title of her most recent book is Flannery O'Connor's Why Do the Heathen Rage? A behind-the-scenes look at a work in progress, published in 2024 and on sale today at a reduced rate of $10 per copy. So if you're interested, Jessica will kindly sign a copy for those who would like to pick up a book today. Hot off the press. So take your chance and take your opportunity to get one today. Prior to this book, her recent work focuses on the intersection of reading, writing, and reflection. And the works include Reading for the Love of God, How to Read as a Spiritual Practice, published in 2023. Scandal of Holiness, Renewing Your Imagination in the Company of Literary Saints, published in 2022, which received accolades and awards. And then Learning the Good Life, Wisdom from the Great Hearts and Minds That Came Before, co-authored with Dr. Jacob Statman, published in 2022. Dr. Hooten Wilson has received numerous fellowships, grants, awards, including a Fulbright Fellowship to the Czech Republic, an NEH grant to study Dante in Florence in 2014, and the Biola Center for Christian Thought and a sabbatical fellowship. In 2018, she received the Emerging Public Intellectual Award given by a coalition of North American think tanks in collaboration with the Center for Christian Scholarship at Redeemer University College. And in 2019, she received the Haidt Prize in Humanities from the Dallas Institute of the Humanities and Culture. Quite impressive resume, and we're fortunate indeed to have her with us this morning to talk about her recent book. So without further ado, please join me in giving a warm waves welcome to Dr. Jessica Hooten Wilson.
That you can hear me. I'm going to start with a prayer by Flannery O'Connor. That was a lovely introduction, but there's absolutely nothing that I do that does not come from God and should point back to God. And so I want to start this morning with Flannery O'Connor's own words about the ways in which she pursued God, loved her Lord, and gave her writing to him. So a lot of the things that we're discussing this morning, I hope you get to see that. If you do pray, you can bow your head. What I am asking for, Lord, is really ridiculous. I am saying at present that I am a cheese, but make me a mystic immediately. God can do that. Make mystics out of cheeses. But why should he do it for an ingrate, slothful and dirty creature like me. I can't stay focused in church to say my prayers. As for preparing for communion the night before, my thoughts are elsewhere. The rosary is mere rote for me while I think of usually impious things, but I would like to be a mystic immediately. But dear God, please give me some place, no matter how small, but let me love it and let my heart overflow with love for it. If I am the one to wash the second step every day, let me know it and wash it, and let my heart overflow washing it. For you love us, our souls too. So take our souls, dear God, because we know that you are all that our souls should want. And if we were wise, you would be all we would want. And the times that we are wise, you are all that we want. And we want more and more to want you. Our demands are absurd. We are moths who would be kings. We are stupid, slothful things sometimes, foolish things, Lord. But we want you to be our lover immediately. If only I can hold God in my mind, if only I could always think of him. In the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. Amen. So I'm not sure how many people are familiar with Flannery O'Connor. I've been spending a large portion of my life studying Flannery O'Connor, and I wanted to take you on a journey to how I got to know Flannery, even if you don't know who she is, but I will make sure to back up a little bit and get to tell you who she is, because the excitement behind this book in particular for me, I want you to feel how exciting this was for me as a person. My journey for Flannery O'Connor actually began when I was 15 years old. And yes, now you can date me. In 1997, I was 15 years old. And I went to Rhodes College. I wanted to be a novelist. And I grew up in a Christian family. And my dad was a little bit afraid of the things that I was writing, because the things I was writing was very dark. I loved the gritty. I loved death. I loved murder. I loved things happening in fiction. And so I wanted to write those same kinds of stories that thrilled me, excited me. And my dad feared for my soul. His 15-year-old was writing all these dark stories, and he wanted me to make sure that I knew the light, that I knew Jesus, and that I could write works for Jesus. And so I started sanitizing all the things I were writing, and instead I started writing these really, well, one professor called them bad PBS sitcoms. It was like not a compliment. And when I was at Rhodes College, this same professor said, you know, you seem to have talent, but you're really wasting it in the way that you're using it. And those were harsh words to hear at 15 years old, but they were also so life-giving. He handed me a copy of Flannery O'Connor's The Life You Save May Be Your Own. And he said, if you're a Christian who likes looking into the darkness to find the light, read this. And it completely changed my life. I started imitating Flannery O'Connor. I won a national short story contest when I was 16 years old. They flew me to DC, and I was on stage, and Hillary Clinton gave me an award, and I thought, this is the secret to life, right? To write like Flannery O'Connor. So I read all her stories. I read her letters. I read her biographies. I read everything I could get my hands on when it came to Flannery. And when I finished my undergrad degree at Seaver College, I thought, I've just got to keep studying her. If I'm going to be a great novelist, which was my dream, I've got to keep working on her. So I went to Baylor, where the dean of O'Connor Studies was, Ralph C. Wood. He had written the book Flannery O'Connor and the Christ-Haunted South and the Comedy of Redemption, and he'd written on her. I wanted to study with him. So I went to be his dissertation student. I wrote a dissertation with him. And that year, in 2009, there was an international Flannery O'Connor conference, the first international conference. And so I flew to Rome. I got to present my dissertation chapters on Flannery and Dostoevsky. And afterwards, the keynotes didn't know any Italian. And because of Pepperdine and being abroad for a year, I knew enough Italian that I became the tour guide for all of these prestigious Flannery O'Connor scholars. And it was me and all of them, and we go to dinner, and they're just talking about Flannery. They know so much, and I'm just eating up everything they're saying. And one of them was Flannery O'Connor's friend. He was in his 80s at the time, and we're talking, and he's like, Dostoevsky is your interest, huh? You know, her most Dostoevskian work was her third novel that she didn't finish. I mean, my jaw just hit the table. I don't even know what else was happening in the rest of the room, but I had just discovered Flannery wrote a novel that no one else knew about. And I went to the archives that fall. I started working through her manuscripts. I thought, this is amazing. I did a very scholarly presentation the next year on her in 2011. And in the room, when I'm giving a presentation in Chicago, is Flannery O'Connor's cousin, also in her 80s, wearing white gloves, a hat. I didn't know she was there. And I'm presenting on this unpublished material that I had read. And she was so impressed with what I did. I was so thankful that she appreciated what I did. And I'm not mocking her when I'm about to use a Southern accent, but my parents are from near Milledgeville, Georgia. So I have to do her justice. She's a beautiful woman. And she said, Billy, and that's Billy Sessions, Billy, go get that girl. We're taking her to Mass. And that's exactly what happened. And they took me to Mass. And she said, if there's anything you need. And Billy said, I know what we need. We need you to finish the unfinished novel. And that's how it started. So here's somebody who has no creds. I hadn't published a book yet. I didn't have any reason that they should have done this. I mean, it was very providential. It was so exciting to be part of this unfinished project. And then now I've spent over 10 years, and I'm going to tell you how hard this project was to do. So it all providentially came together for me to be able to do it. But how do you do something so big? Well, it required a lot of rejection and a lot of patience. And so I'm going to walk you through that part of the process. Going through the archives. Who is Flannery O'Connor, though? For those of you who don't know, so please raise your hand for me if you have heard of Flannery O'Connor and read Flannery O'Connor. Perfect, great. Okay, so we don't have to do a whole lot of jumping into her story, but I'll just do a very, very little bit. She's just one of my favorite people. And I usually put the stamp up here just for everyone to realize it's not some unknown author that I just kind of like. There's a stamp of her face. Most of us are not going to get to be stamps. So it has some awareness that she's kind of important in literary letters in America. She was cradle-born Catholic, and that is in southern Georgia. So she's in Savannah. She was born March 25th, 1925. I usually tell people her birth date just because it's an important date if you're aware of Catholic calendars. March 25th is the day of Annunciation. Thank you. It's also, if you're into literature, it's the day that Dante enters the Inferno. It's also the day that Sauron is defeated in Lord of the Rings, because those who write as Catholics know this day, and it becomes relevant for what they're doing. So the Lord has her birthed on this day. I think that's kind of special. And her 100th anniversary is next year, 2025, right? So we're looking at Flannery at 99. So she's born in a world of very Protestant South. She's a minority in that sense in her culture. You have to remember that in Georgia, even the generation right before her, there were laws against Catholics. There were things they couldn't do. There was a long time where they couldn't own property. There was a long time where they couldn't vote. And a lot of that heritage was still kind of in that culture, right? This kind of mistrust of Catholics, not being part of the church, not necessarily being Christians. They eat the body of Christ, kind of weird, right? But she's in this little enclave. She's on a very wealthy corner. She herself was not wealthy. She was given a home by her aunt. I think that's also important to remember. You're not just talking about someone who is wealthy, white privilege, as we might think. Instead, she is living off of the handouts of her relatives. Her father struggled. He was a veteran. He struggled to get jobs. He struggled to get work. And they were kind of living from house to house as they could, with people taking care of them as she was growing up. Her father died when she was 16. So also any source of income at that point became even harder. And her mother had to go work her brother's farm to be able to pay for them, right, to be able to afford their life. She went to the local college. She said, thankfully, my gift of non-retention means my education has not been a burden to me. In other words, she did not receive a strong education. She said she didn't read a book until she went to grad school. So when she went off to the University of Iowa and got her MFA, was the first time she was introduced to the world of literature. Before that, she was in a lot of progressive education schools that didn't require much of their students. So she kind of just flew through. So she graduated at 16 and went off to the University of Iowa. When she's in the MFA program, there's kind of a funny story. This is a young Southern girl going off for the first time to live in another state, in another place. And she decides, although she came there for journalism, she really wants to write fiction. So she goes to the director of the program and she tries to tell him, I want to write a novel. And her accent is so thick, he's like, what did you say? I want to write a novel. He's like, can you write it down for me, what you're saying? But it is true, she had a very thick accent. So she, again, is kind of an outsider in a new place. She's surrounded by secularism in ways that she hasn't seen. She's been very protected. She's attended Mass every day of her life. These journals that she wrote, where she wrote down her prayers, was the first time that she had practiced writing prayers, apart from the prayers that she knew her whole life. And so you see her kind of broadening out from her culture. You'll see why that's important in a second, but essentially she's growing up in a very segregated, mannered world in southern Georgia. And she's going off to Iowa, where the world is more integrated, where people are not religious. She's encountering a lot of difference than she had had at home. And when she returns home, she's bringing both the perspective of an insider and the perspective of an outsider to her world. She does end up having to go home for the rest of her life. And the reason why is what her father died from, lupus, when she was 16. She finds out when she's 25 that she too has lupus. And she at first is kind of hopeful it's just arthritis, but it becomes very difficult for her to type, very difficult for her to walk. She's trying to live off, on her own after grad school in New York and then Connecticut, and she has to return home. And so when she returns home, her mother decides they're going to move to the farm in Andalusia. Flannery is going to move there with her, live on the first floor so she doesn't have to climb stairs. And she essentially becomes an exile in her own world there in Georgia for the last 14 years, living off cortisone shots, trying to survive the best that she can, and not knowing how much longer she's going to have. Because again, her father was diagnosed, he died months later. So when she receives the diagnosis, she's very fearful about how many years she has left. So when you get to read Flannery, you should almost read the kind of spiritual urgency that is in her work. She is writing as though writing is life or death. And I think it provides a great spiritual context for the kind of work that she's doing. If you have heard of Flannery before 2020, you, I think, are blessed in some ways to have a longer relationship with her. A lot of people who are introduced to her now are introduced to her with this more solid burden in the conversation regarding race. In 2020, Paul Ely, who was one of her biographers, was able to publish some of her letters that another trusted scholar had actually published. And he took that as an opportunity to put them out there. The estate had kind of hidden them for a long time. And when I say hidden them, they hid them because they were embarrassed. They were worth being embarrassed over. Flannery said a lot of racist things, especially in her younger years. We'll talk more about her later years. That's the reason I'm publishing the book I'm publishing. But in her early years, there's a lot of racist things, and they hid them. And they came out, of course, 2020 in the height of Black Lives Matter. He put this in the New Yorker. It's a very incendiary title. How racist was Flannery O'Connor? Well, you don't even get a chance to say if she is or not a racist. You just, how racist was she, right? The answer is like in the question itself. And so this became the controversy. I think one of the best responses was not actually mine. I put mine up there just to show you, like, I did respond to what was going on. But the best response, if you're interested, is by Amy Alsner. The reason I think it's so good is she points out the fact that when Paul Ely publishes this piece, How Racist Was Flannery, and shows all these letters from when Flannery was in her 20s, he assumes that Flannery O'Connor scholars don't want to look at this side of Flannery, that we just refuse to address the fact that she wrote racist letters when she was young and that she potentially had these kind of evils in her past and sins of her past. Amy Alsner points out, actually, if Paul Ely would have addressed any of the work done by women or persons of color, we've all been writing on this for a very long time. And so when he says that it's being ignored, yep, it's been ignored primarily by a lot of white male scholars who weren't writing on race when it comes to Flannery O'Connor. But there were a lot of others of us that have been writing on race and Flannery O'Connor for a while. And so she brings out some of the best scholars on this, Hilton Als, Alice Walker. These are people that were not ignoring the race issue in Flannery O'Connor, and they were actually handling it really well. So read her piece if you're interested. We will talk a little bit about it, but it kind of gives you the context for my book. It's an important context. Let me tell you a little bit about the story, and then you'll see, I'm going to get into like who the character is in a minute, but it's called Why Did the Heathen Rage? They actually get the title wrong in Esquire, but you see that middle copy, that's 1963. So it's the year before she dies. She dies August 1964. Esquire asked a bunch of authors, do you have anything you are currently working on in 1963? Give us an excerpt of it. And so Saul Bellow is in there, kind of some of the, Kurt Vonnegut, some of the best writers in the 60s are sending excerpts to Esquire. And she sends her third novel, right? So you would think that all of us would have known about it, but instead they end up publishing this as a short story after Flannery dies. And so most people lose track of the novel itself. But it was an in-process piece, and it was meant to be from a novel. It was not a short story in and by itself, which is key, because it's not a completed work. When she's writing this, Flannery has a reputation for a certain kind of story. So I just got done spending 2 weeks teaching Flannery. Her stories are often scandalous. And since most of you have familiarity with her, you kind of know the Flannery O'Connor plots. Most of the plots are a young, disgruntled, intellectual son or daughter, and they return home to the South. You'll see the parallels with Flannery pretty obviously. And then you have the mother who's the overbearing, domineering, working the farm, right? And usually that mother is the one who is racist and small-minded and so forth, right? And there's this conflict that's created between the two characters. And in order for one of them to receive what Flannery calls a moment of grace, there's a violent intrusion into the narrative, right? That's kind of the formula, not to make it too formulaic. But that's usually what happens in a Flannery O'Connor story. So you can get gored by a bull, you can get killed by a serial killer, your leg could get stolen by a Bible salesman, right? The options are endless for how violence is going to intrude in the story. But at the same time, that's what usually happens in her work. Well, there's a few things that changed for Flannery in the 60s. One, she's gifted a television. She's gifted a television in the 1960s by some nuns who are very grateful for her for some work that she did for kind of pro bono. And so she has a TV. Now, this will come out to play in a second. If she's trying to shock people towards grace, right? And the shock in Flannery is usually like a confrontation of, you are a sinful person. If she's going to introduce a moment of grace, she has to make you want to have grace. You have to realize you need grace. So she usually shocks you into an awareness of your need for grace. Well, the kind of shock she's doing that is so violent, if you have the TV in your house, that shock is not going to be able to compete with the television. And one of the key moments is in 1963, she watches JFK get assassinated in her living room, is what it feels like. And that moment changes things for her. How can she write shocking violence for a world that can have an assassination of your president in your living room? So she realizes the necessity of changing the kinds of stories that she's telling. The second is she gets a letter from a famous novelist called J.F. Powers. He's kind of a comedic novelist, National Book Award winner. And he writes her a letter and he says, why do you kill off your characters every time things get good? You just get started. They accept a moment of grace and then goodbye, new Christian. Like, that's it for them. And she writes back to him like, you're making a really good point. I had not thought of that. And so she changes. So if you read A Good Man is Hard to Find as her first short story collection, and you compare it with Everything Rises Must Converge, in Everything Rises Must Converge, there's a lot less death. There's a couple that are still that 1960 letter, but for the most part, a lot more people live, right? They convert, and there's possibilities. One in particular, which we'll talk about in a second, is from The Enduring Chill, but also from Everything Rises Must Converge, The Comforts of Home. These young intellectual men who get to stay alive become the subject matter for this next novel. Finally, the last part. There's a columnist who's writing a bunch of columns called Why Do the Heathen Rage? And the way that, I don't know how to imagine him. I am not on social media enough to figure out like who would be the parallel, but think of like a super angry, unintelligent person who regularly gets to tweet what he or she wants to say about the world. That's all I'm going to say. So she decides to respond to this, and essentially, like our versions of the internet troll, she is trying to respond to that columnist. He's out there representing Christianity by angrily writing these columns against everything that he hates in the world. And so what she does is she takes the title of his column, and it becomes what she's going to approach in her next work. The main character of this next work is called Walter Tillman, and the names always have meaning in Flannery. That's kind of the fun part, is to investigate, what she's doing with these different names. So Walter the Penniless, you have these kind of like precursors of saints in the name Walter, which gives you a lot of hope, and also I think gives the direction of the book, but it's unfinished, so I'll explain that in a second. But that's where I would take it if I was writing all of it. Asbury, Julian, Thomas, they all look like Walter, and even in the manuscripts themselves, she alternates between those names. Walter is the name that comes up the most in the pages we have left. We had about 378 pages that I went through, but in those pages, I would say you see these names probably a dozen or more times. So she is thinking about these same characters from the Everything Rises Must Converge collection, and she's keeping them alive. The difference is she wants to start with conversion rather than move towards it. So if you're familiar again with her work, you get to that moment of grace. Do you accept it? Do you reject it? Most of her characters, right, are accepting it, and then the story ends. What if she starts with the acceptance? And she's actually reading C.S. Lewis a lot at the end of her life. And so she's reading C.S. Lewis, and she's reading his autobiography. And in his autobiography, do you remember how C.S. Lewis is converted? It's an intellectual assent, right? And as he's moved intellectually and surprised by joy, he's then in a sidecar and his brother Warnie, and they're driving to the zoo. And he said, before we left for the zoo, I didn't believe that Jesus Christ is my Lord. And by the time we got there, I did. That's like the least dramatic conversion ever, right? How do you make a story like that? So what she's trying to do is she wants to show the intellectual assent that takes you to that place, and then an undramatic conversion. But then we have what I think would have been a holy fool, a crazy figure who embraces Jesus Christ. And how do you actually live that life in the nihilistic society that she's often observing? That seems to be the goal that she was going towards. When she creates this, I'm just going to read, this is one passage from her. I won't read a lot from the book itself, but you can purchase it, but I'm at least going to read this one passage, because this is his conversion scene. She said that she wanted it to be like God approaching Elias in the cave, right? It's a still small voice moment. He had not, up until that moment, been a believer. Do you hear the parallel with Lewis, right? Yeah. But he realized then with a shudder that he was a Christian bound for hell. His throat had gone instantly dry, his face had grown pale, and it looked as if the countryside had dropped away from the rock he had sat on, and he and the rock were suspended over nothing. Walter knew the fathers of the church. He had assisted at Nicaea and at Chalcedon. He had explored the intricacies of light with Bonaventure. He knew where Aquinas and Duns Scotus would part company. He had seen the path turn downward with Abelard and illogic enter, grandly eloquent with Luther. He had been active at Trent. He had adhered always to the most orthodox line, but never once, never for the slightest moment, had it occurred to him, even remotely, to believe any of it, or that there was the least danger of his doing so. Only now it simply appeared the accomplished truth. Grace originated elsewhere, and grace was it mattered. And worse, the woman mattered. I'll get to the woman. So what he realizes in this moment, in this conversion scene, and we have lots of different versions of this scene, is that the woman that he's been writing letters to actually matters. The woman's name is Una Gibbs, and she's modeled a little bit on Dorothy Day. Any familiar with Dorothy Day? Okay, she's modeled a little on Dorothy Day. She's also modeled on one of Flannery's friends named Mariette Lee, who's a playwright. The key is that they were activists in the civil rights movement from the North, and Una Gibbs is one of these. And Walter has been writing letters to these people, pretending to be somebody else. So, for example, he writes to a poet who writes really bad poetry, and he pretends to be a bad poet who needs help. And then when he gets tired of writing bad poetry to the poet, he just writes deceased, returned to sender on the envelope and sends it back. Another time he writes to a pastor who's a Methodist pastor and pretends to have all these qualms about faith, and they start to have a religious dialogue. And then when he gets bored, he writes deceased, returned to sender. Okay, so you see, he doesn't care about people. He's playing with people, right? Just pretending to be other people through the mail. But with Una Gibbs, something is different. He's writing this civil rights activist pretending to care, and she seems to care, and he's falling for her as a person. We don't know if it would have been a love interest, a deeper friendship. Something is happening emotionally with Walter in his response to her. And so he decides to test her affection. He tests her affection by saying, "I'm black, you would never actually love me." This is where I think the novel gets so interesting. And people who think that Flannery is only dealing with race on the periphery, this was her final novel, that she was trying to investigate these questions much more closely. To give you some context, because the whole idea of blackface should strike you as awful, someone had done this. So she's not making up the idea of blackface without any comments on it. She's trying to take what was happening in the news. So in 1961, there's a book called Black Like Me, where a white guy pretended to be black by having blackface, as though just changing the color of his skin would change his very experience in the South. And he went and did things in the South and then reported on it as a journalist. And it was a best-selling book. So Flannery's testing these things that she's observing in reality. What does this mean? Can you understand the black experience by being a white man in the South who pretends to have a black face? It's a really good question, and there's not a lot of other people that are asking it. There's a lot of people that are just buying this book. And she's asking this question in her art. Even in the manuscript yourself, you see her asking questions like, some of the people who worked on her farm were African Americans, and she's like, what are they thinking? What are they feeling? How would I know this? Right? It was a reality of her time that any interaction she would have had with African Americans, they would have been performing roles to her, right? She's in a position of power on this farm. They want to keep their job. She doesn't have real relationships. She's in a segregated world, trying to understand what an integrated world could look like. But she dies a month after LBJ signs the Civil Rights Act. So the progress that she's making in this fiction, what I feel like it does is gives us a lot of hope for her journey forward. I'm not arguing that she actually makes that progress in this novel. I'm just arguing that she was going somewhere. And that one of the mistakes I feel like we make when we look at Flannery is that we don't see her as a work in progress. She died in 1960s. She had these things that sometimes seemed like they were racist in her biography. Her work itself doesn't seem racist. We can justify usually teaching her work. Her work was reaching beyond her own human limitations in a lot of ways. But I think almost any argument that says we know what she was is a false argument. Because people, I would hope each of us would see ourselves this way, people are in process. She calls human beings goods under construction, that there's sanctification happening, that each of us hopefully is going to be better tomorrow than we are today, and that we want people to have the same kind of charity towards us when they talk and interact with us, that if we say stupid stuff, they call us on it, and that maybe we'll say something less dumb the next day, right? When we look at Flannery and we get to see this work that she was in the middle of, I think we get to see that potential development. And I think when we consider her overall oeuvre, we should understand that she wasn't done, that if she could have continued, what could we have had from her? Most of her relatives died in their 90s, and she died at 39. I know that not everyone in this room is 39, but I don't want anyone to judge me by what I did at 39. I hope that I've grown. I hope that I continue growing. And so I think this is what we get to see in her work. Alice Walker, when Alice Walker goes and visits her home in 1975, wonders the same thing. And this is 1975. This is why Paul Ealy's piece, I think, is short-sighted. Because Alice Walker in 1975 is saying, what if? What if Flannery could have headed the same direction as her art as a person? And her art gives us a glimpse of that. And without Flannery, Alice is saying we've lost half the story. In the same way that Alice hopes you see, without Alice Walker, you've lost half the story. That you do need more perspectives than your own. It's one of the reasons that I asked this book to be illustrated. And so if you are able to get a copy of it, there are beautiful illustrations. This is, I guess it's recorded, but this is kind of off the record. I bought the illustrations myself. I paid for them. And the reason that I paid for them is because I think it is so important. Publishers don't care about illustrations. It doesn't help them sell books or make money. What I think is important is to recognize that this is a full conversation and that I can only see one part of it, but having one of my friends who's an African-American illustrator get to respond to her stories with his art and his work and have another conversation shows you what I hope the book can accomplish. That the book can start conversations, can invite us into dialogue, in which hopefully we all can continue as works in progress towards something greater. As I close here, I want to show you a short trailer. Next week, there's another Flannery opportunity. Ethan Hawke and Maya Hawke have just created a film, and it is the life of Flannery O'Connor, so I want to end with hopefully getting to show you the film. Where would that be? Here? Oh. All right. Here's the trailer, and I'll close with this.
The sky was underpinned with long silver streaks that looked like scaffolding, but no one was paying any attention to the sky.
Well, I don't understand why you don't want to write something that people would like to read.
Dear God, I want to write a novel. A good novel.
Miss O'Connor, sometimes I feel like you're trying to stick pins in your readers. I don't think you need to make them suffer in order to introduce them to the unusual way your mind works.
Mary Flannery, you been writing any cute stories lately? I read that last one you sent your mama. You know, it left kind of a bad taste in my mouth. Well, you weren't supposed to eat it.
You might want to consider being a little more friendly.
I tried to turn the other cheek, but my tongue was always in it. I need to be working.
You need to rest. Nowadays, doctors don't let young people die.
Dear God, please. I can never seem to escape myself unless I'm writing. Strangely, I'm never more myself than when I'm writing. Is there no way for me to disappear into something bigger? Lord, please grant me grace. Let me be your typewriter. Please give me one good story. I thought it would be the ending of any creation. Now I see it as only the beginning.
It must come easy for you.
It's like giving birth to a piano sideways.
Okay, thank you.